Doctors noticed something strange in operating rooms for years, and nobody could fully explain it. Patients with red hair kept waking up during surgery when they should have been completely unconscious. They kept feeling pain when the drugs should have blocked it. They needed more medication than everyone else, sometimes far more, and for a long time doctors assumed these patients were just nervous, or exaggerating, or unusually sensitive in a way that had nothing to do with biology. It took decades of careful research to figure out the real reason, and when scientists finally found it, the answer was sitting inside a single gene that also happens to control hair color. This is the story of how DNA finally explained one of the strangest and most persistent mysteries in modern anesthesia. If you are new here, hit subscribe. I cover strange and surprising science stories like this every single week, and this one might be one of the most unexpected connections in all of human genetics. Now let's get into what researchers actually discovered about red hair and pain. Red hair is rare. Only around 1 to 2% of people on the entire planet carry it naturally. It shows up most often in populations from Northern and Western Europe, especially in places like Scotland, Ireland, and parts of Scandinavia. Though small numbers of natural redheads exist in nearly every population on Earth. For most of recorded history, red hair was treated as nothing more than an unusual cosmetic trait, something people associated with fiery tempers, folklore, superstition, or pale skin that burns easily in the sun. Nobody imagined that this specific hair color could be tied to how a person's entire nervous system reacts to medication. That assumption turned out to be completely wrong, and the real explanation is far more interesting than anyone expected. The story begins with a gene called MC1R. This gene sits on chromosome 16, and it carries the instructions for building something called the melanocortin-1 receptor. This receptor sits on the surface of skin cells known as melanocytes, and its main job is to help decide what kind of pigment those cells produce. When the receptor functions normally, it signals the cell to produce a dark pigment called eumelanin. Eumelanin is responsible for brown and black hair, and it also does an effective job of shielding skin from ultraviolet radiation coming from the sun. In people with natural red hair, the MC1R gene carries specific mutations that change the physical shape of this receptor. A receptor with the wrong shape cannot properly receive or respond to the signal sent to it. Instead of triggering the production of dark eumelanin, the skin cells switch over to producing a different pigment called pheomelanin. Pheomelanin is responsible for the reddish and yellowish tones seen in red hair, and it also tends to come packaged with very fair, freckled skin that burns easily rather than tanning in the sun. This part of the story explains the physical, visible traits that most people already associate with red hair, but scientists eventually discovered that MC1R does something far more significant than simply controlling pigment production. It also plays a direct role in how the body senses, processes, and responds to pain and to certain classes of drugs. The melanocortin system, the broader network of receptors that MC1R belongs to, is not limited to skin cells alone. Related receptors from the same family are found throughout the brain and central nervous system, including regions directly involved in pain signaling and in how the body responds to opioid medications. One particularly important receptor in this family is heavily involved in the brain's natural built-in pain control pathways. Because the MC1R mutations responsible for red hair disrupt the normal balance of this wider receptor family, they end up altering how the entire pain and sedation system behaves, not just how skin cells decide which pigment to produce. Researchers first began paying serious attention to this connection following a landmark study conducted at the University of Louisville in the early 2000s. Anesthesiologists there had quietly noticed a pattern building up over years of clinical experience. Patients with naturally red hair seemed to consistently require noticeably higher doses of certain anesthetic drugs to reach the exact same level of sedation as everyone else in the operating room. At first, this observation seemed like it could simply be a coincidence, or perhaps some kind of unconscious bias in how doctors perceived and treated redheaded patients differently. So the research team decided to design a properly controlled study to test whether the pattern held up under real scientific scrutiny. They compared one group of people with natural red hair against a second group of people with dark hair, using a commonly administered inhaled anesthetic gas during the trial. The results came back clear, consistent, and statistically significant. The redheaded participants required roughly 20% more anesthetic gas to reach the same depth of unconsciousness compared to the dark-haired control group. This was not a small, random fluctuation buried in the noise of the data. It was a measurable, repeatable pattern directly tied to hair color, and by extension, tied to the underlying MC1R gene sitting quietly beneath that hair color the entire time. Later studies built on this original discovery and expanded the picture even further, finding that the pattern reached well beyond simply needing more anesthetic gas during surgery. People with natural red hair also tend to show greater sensitivity to certain specific types of pain, particularly pain triggered by heat and cold. In several controlled experiments, redheaded participants consistently reported feeling pain at lower temperature thresholds compared to participants with other hair colors. Their nervous system seemed to register thermal pain earlier and more intensely, almost as if their internal pain detection system had a lower trigger point built into it from birth. At the same time, researchers uncovered something else that initially seemed almost contradictory. People with red hair often responded noticeably better to opioid pain medications compared to people without the mutation. Several studies found that redheaded patients needed smaller doses of certain opioid drugs to achieve effective pain control after surgery, even though those same patients needed larger amounts of inhaled anesthetic gas to remain unconscious during the actual procedure. This split reaction, needing more of one category of drug while needing less of another, puzzled researchers for a while until they looked more closely at exactly how the melanocortin receptor family connects into different branches of the brain's broader pain and sedation circuitry. The explanation researchers eventually settled on involves the body's own internal pain control system. The human body naturally produces its own opioid-like chemicals, and receptors within the melanocortin family interact directly with the same brain circuits that external opioid drugs act upon. When MC1R carries a mutation, this delicate interaction gets thrown out of balance. The end result is a nervous system that behaves differently across several distinct types of drugs and physical stimuli all at once. It is not simply a case of redheaded patients needing more medicine across the board. It is a specific, targeted rewiring of how certain pain and sedation pathways respond to different chemical triggers caused entirely by one small genetic change that also happens to be responsible for turning someone's hair red. This discovery carried real, practical consequences for modern medicine, not just as an interesting piece of trivia to mention at dinner parties. Anesthesiologists gradually began treating red hair as a genuine clinical clue worth factoring into their planning, rather than dismissing it as an irrelevant cosmetic detail. Some hospitals started incorporating hair color into pre-surgery assessments, quietly adjusting their anesthetic dosing expectations for patients who mentioned they had naturally red hair. Dentists took notice as well. Multiple studies found that redheaded patients reported significantly higher anxiety surrounding routine dental procedures and often required extra local anesthetic injections to achieve proper numbness, a pattern likely tied directly to the same underlying pain sensitivity differences uncovered in the anesthesia research. It is worth being very clear about exactly what this research shows and what it does not show, because the topic gets misunderstood fairly often. This effect is not about dyed red hair. The genetic influence only applies to people who carry the natural MC1R mutations responsible for red hair, mutations that trace back through their biological ancestry over many generations. Dyeing your hair red with a box of dye from the store does not change your MC1R gene in any way, and it will not change how your body responds to anesthesia or pain medication. It is also important to note that not every single redheaded person will display the exact same degree of sensitivity. Genetics rarely produces clean, absolute results across an entire population. There are several different variants of the MC1R gene, some more strongly linked to red hair and pale skin than others, and the overall strength of the anesthesia effect can vary depending on which specific mutation a person carries and whether they inherited one copy or two copies of the relevant variant from their parents. This entire situation raises an interesting broader point about how genes actually function inside the body. Most people naturally assume that a gene linked to something as simple as hair color would only ever affect hair color and nothing else, but biology rarely stays that neatly contained within one narrow lane. Genes frequently sit inside much larger, interconnected systems, and a single mutation can ripple outward into completely unrelated bodily functions that seem to have nothing to do with the original trait. MC1R stands as a near-perfect example of this. It first became a subject of serious study because of pigmentation and skin cancer risk, since dermatologists cared deeply about protecting fair-skinned, easily burned populations from sun damage. Nobody involved in that early research ever expected MC1R to also become a gene that anesthesiologists needed to think carefully about before wheeling a patient into surgery. Yet that is exactly where the science eventually led. This kind of overlapping influence is called pleiotropy, a term scientists use to describe situations where one single gene influences multiple, seemingly unconnected traits at the same time. Pleiotropy shows up throughout the human genome far more often than most people realize. A gene tied primarily to eye color might also play a small, quiet role in disease resistance elsewhere in the body. A gene linked mainly to height might also subtly influence certain hormone levels. The human body functions as one deeply interconnected system, not as a simple collection of separate, isolated parts, each controlled independently by its own private instruction manual. The connection between red hair and anesthesia response stands as one of the clearest, most thoroughly documented examples of this principle in modern medical research, which is part of the reason it now gets cited so frequently in genetics courses and medical training programs around the world. Scientists have also spent considerable time investigating why the MC1R mutations responsible for red hair became relatively common in certain populations in the first place, particularly across Northern Europe. The leading explanation ties directly back to sunlight exposure and vitamin D production. In regions marked by long, dark winters and comparatively weak sunlight throughout much of the year, pale skin that produces less of the sun-blocking eumelanin pigment allows the body to absorb more available ultraviolet light through the skin, which in turn helps the body produce vitamin D more efficiently despite limited sun exposure. Over many thousands of years, this trait gave a genuine survival advantage to people carrying these mutations in low sunlight environments, even though the very same mutations also come bundled with a higher risk of sunburn and skin cancer whenever exposure to stronger, more direct sunlight occurs. Nobody was selecting for how future generations would respond to modern surgical anesthesia drugs, since anesthesia, as we understand it today, did not exist for most of human history. The unusual pain, sensitivity, and drug response differences we now understand were simply an unplanned, invisible side effect that came bundled along with a mutation originally being favored by natural selection for a completely different, unrelated reason. This naturally raises a bigger, more uncomfortable question about how much of modern medicine still needs to catch up with discoveries like this one. For the vast majority of the history of anesthesiology as a medical field, drug dosing was calculated based largely on general population averages, along with factors like body weight, age, and the individual clinical judgment of the anesthesiologist standing in the room. The idea that a purely visible cosmetic trait like hair color could serve as a meaningful clinical signal for adjusting drug dosages was simply not something doctors were ever trained to seriously consider. There's also a much broader lesson buried inside all of this research about the nature of pain itself. For a very long time, pain was treated by much of the medical establishment as something fairly uniform and standardized across all patients, as if everyone experienced the exact same physical stimulus in roughly the exact same way, and any noticeable differences between patients were assumed to be mostly psychological, emotional, or simply exaggerated. The red hair research pushed back hard against that long-standing assumption using solid, repeatable, quantifiable data. It demonstrated clearly that pain perception carries a real, measurable genetic component that can differ meaningfully from one person to the next, based on something as narrow and specific as a single gene variant. This finding has since encouraged a wave of additional research into other genetic factors that might influence pain sensitivity and individual drug response across different populations, pushing the entire field of anesthesiology further toward what researchers now often call personalized medicine, where treatment gets carefully tailored to a person's actual underlying biology, rather than simply relying on a broad, generalized average drawn from the wider population. Researchers have since gone on to identify several other genes that appear to influence pain sensitivity and anesthetic drug requirements to a smaller, more modest degree, though none of them have proven anywhere near as strongly documented or as visually obvious to spot as MC1R and its clear connection to red hair. This growing body of research has opened the door to specialized genetic testing panels that some hospitals now use for patients with particularly complicated pain management histories, screening for a handful of known variants that can help predict unusual responses to otherwise standard drug doses ahead of time. In many ways, red hair essentially served as the visible tip of a much larger genetic iceberg, one that scientists are still slowly mapping out gene by gene, study by study, year after year. It is also worth pausing to look at this discovery from the patient's side of things, rather than purely from a clinical research perspective. For years, long before the underlying science had fully caught up, many people with red hair reported feeling quietly dismissed by doctors and dentists whenever they mentioned that local anesthetic simply did not seem to work as well for them compared to what other people described. Some patients were told the problem was purely psychological, or that they were simply more anxious than the average patient sitting in the same waiting room. The Louisville study, along with the wave of follow-up research that came after it, finally gave these patients a genuine, verifiable biological explanation for an experience they had been quietly living with for their entire lives. It had transformed something that had often been casually brushed aside into a properly documented medical fact, backed by carefully controlled studies and consistently repeated results across multiple independent research teams. None of this means that every single redheaded person walking into a hospital today needs to panic, or should automatically assume they are guaranteed to have a difficult or painful experience with anesthesia. Modern anesthesiologists receive extensive training to monitor every patient closely throughout an entire procedure, regardless of hair color, adjusting drug doses in real time based on live vital signs and the observed depth of sedation, rather than blindly relying on a single fixed calculation decided before the surgery even begins. Simply knowing about the MC1R connection gives medical teams one additional useful piece of information to keep in mind, particularly during the earlier planning stage, so that important dosing conversations can start from a more genuinely informed place rather than catching everyone involved by surprise partway through an already stressful procedure. What makes this entire story so remarkable is just how far the effects of one single tiny genetic mutation can travel throughout the human body. A change responsible for something as simple and immediately visible as hair color ends up reaching deep into pain receptors, brain chemistry, and the way an entire nervous system responds to some of the most carefully calculated, closely monitored drugs used anywhere in modern medicine. It stands as a powerful reminder that the human body rarely draws clean, neat lines between its different internal systems. A trait we can casually observe from the outside with our own eyes turns out to be quietly connected to something happening deep inside the nervous system that nobody would ever guess simply by looking at a person walking down the street. Scientists around the world continue to actively study the melanocortin system today, not only for what it reveals specifically about redheaded patients, but for what it might eventually teach researchers about pain and drug response far more broadly across the entire human population. Gaining a deeper understanding of exactly how MC1R interacts with opioid receptors and the brain's pain pathways could eventually help researchers design significantly better, more targeted pain medications for absolutely everyone, not only for the small 1% to 2% of the global population currently carrying red hair mutations. In that meaningful sense, this unusual genetic quirk tied to a fairly rare hair color has quietly become one of the more genuinely useful case studies pushing the entire field of anesthesia research steadily forward. It also connects to a wider conversation happening across genetics right now about how much individual variation gets flattened out by broad medical guidelines built for the average patient. Body weight charts, standard dosing tables, and general treatment protocols were never designed with rare genetic variants in mind, simply because most of these variants had not even been discovered yet when the original guidelines were written decades ago. As genetic testing becomes cheaper, faster, and far more widely available than it used to be, more of these hidden connections are likely to surface, revealing additional small but meaningful ways that a person's DNA quietly shapes how their body responds to treatments that were originally designed around population-wide averages rather than individual biology. There's even a practical takeaway hiding inside all of this for ordinary people watching this video right now, whether they happen to have red hair themselves or not. It highlights just how valuable it can be to mention specific, seemingly unrelated details to a doctor or dentist before any kind of procedure, even details that feel completely irrelevant on the surface, like natural hair color, family history of unusual drug reactions, or past experiences where standard doses simply did not seem to work as expected. Medicine is steadily moving toward a future where these small personal details increasingly matter, and the red hair and anesthesia connection stands as solid proof that a detail this small can genuinely change clinical outcomes for real patients in real operating rooms. It is also worth mentioning that this is far from the only place in medicine where a visible trait has ended up connecting to something completely unexpected happening internally. Researchers studying earlobe attachment once looked for links to cardiovascular disease. Scientists studying finger-length ratios have investigated possible connections to hormone exposure before birth. Most of these other examples turned out to be weak, inconsistent, or simply not replicated when tested by independent labs. The red hair and anesthesia connection stands apart because it has been tested repeatedly in different countries by different research teams using different anesthetic drugs, and the results keep pointing in the same direction every time. That level of consistency is part of why the scientific community accepted it so readily compared to many other proposed trait-based medical links that quietly faded away after failing to hold up under closer scrutiny. The story also offers a useful case study in how slow and cautious good science tends to move, even when doctors on the ground have already noticed a pattern with their own eyes. Anesthesiologists were informally talking about redheaded patients needing extra medication long before any formal study confirmed it. Clinical folklore like this exists throughout medicine, passed between doctors and nurses through shared experience rather than published data. Most of these informal observations never get properly tested, and many of them turn out to be wrong once someone finally runs a controlled trial. Red hair happened to be one of the rare cases where the folklore turned out to be completely accurate, and where a research team was willing to spend the time and resources needed to prove it scientifically, rather than letting it remain an unverified rumor passed around hospital break rooms for another few decades. Looking ahead, Some researchers are now interested in whether similar genetic clues might exist for other visible traits beyond hair color. Could certain eye colors, skin tones, or even less obvious physical markers end up connected to other differences in how people respond to common medications? So far, nothing has emerged with anywhere near the strength or consistency of the MC1R and anesthesia link, but the door has clearly been opened. Before this research came out, almost nobody was seriously looking for connections between cosmetic traits and drug response at all. Now that one solid example exists and is held up under years of scrutiny, more scientists are willing to ask the question in other areas of the genome, which means more discoveries like this one may still be waiting to be found. So the next time you happen to see someone with naturally red hair, there is a genuine chance their body is quietly running on a slightly different internal rulebook compared to most of the people standing around them. A rulebook written by a single gene that never actually stopped being active outside of skin cells, even though everyone assumed for generations that its only real job was deciding hair color. It stands as a small but genuinely powerful example of just how much remains hidden inside human DNA, still waiting patiently to be discovered, simply because someone standing in an operating room finally decided to stop and ask why.